Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Oh, Miles here.
Owl Post for the week is freshly delivered, and I am just so excited to be here as we are at the end here of the Order of the Phoenix, just the last few chapters, and with me, as she is every single week, the overexcited Andrea Coffman.
I wish everyone could see the irony of that, because as he's saying the overexcited, I'm doing like a big ol' yawn. Hello, everyone.
Well, I think it's normal, you know, if you're a mom of a young one, to probably be yawning. You know, that's kind of par for the course, right?
Well, it's nap time in the house right now while we're recording, and so I'm really tempted to take my own nap right now. So I think it's just like, you know, when you see someone yawn and then it's, I feel like that's a little bit of what's happening with nap time here. Cats are napping, kid is napping, I think my husband's napping on the couch, so...
And we are going to talk Harry Potter instead.
Which is super exciting. It's up there with nap time, I gotta say.
It's true, especially where we are in the book. So before we get there, though, we had a little message for us on Instagram. Hannah Banana Dog said, "Hello, this is my dog's account, but I just wanted to let you know that I recently started listening to this podcast, and it's great. I'm already halfway through Book 2's chapters, and I hope to get caught up with your guys' live releases. Love hearing all the tidbits I may have missed, like NHN locking Peeves in the Vanishing Cabinet, but also you guys missed or didn't mention when Harry hides in the other one at Borgin and Burke's. That is true, he does hide in the in Borgin and Burke's, but he doesn't close the door all the way, so he doesn't go a-vanishing. But thank you so much. I'm really glad that your dog allowed you to use their account. I mean, I know how animals can be about their Instagram accounts. Pretty precious stuff there. So thank you so much. And honestly,
Headless Nick.
Yeah. It's just so much fun to hear that people are loving the show and enjoying, you know, our conversations about them. So hit us up wherever you get your podcasts. A star rating review, of course, on Apple Podcasts really helps the show. You can find us all over the place. We're on Instagram at The Nerd Party. We're on Twitter at Join Nerd Party. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/The Nerd Party. You can find us online at thenerdparty.com. And, of course, you can write us an email at thenerdparty.com/contact. Choose a show, choose Owl Post, and then that comes to Dre and I. So many different ways to contact us, which we honestly love. It's just, again, it's a real joy to know that people are listening to the show and to hear what they think about our conversation. So,
especially when you care enough to use your dog's Instagram account.
Exactly.
A true fan, right?
You know,
there.
hijack somebody else's Instagram account and let us know what you think.
Your husband, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend.
Hide your dog, hide your kids, hide your wife. So
take their Instagram.
Exactly. So this chapter, we pick right back up, and we get to the fact that we've got everybody surrounding Harry Potter and his friends in the Department of Ministries, in the hall, I guess you would call it, of prophecy. And Harry isn't quite sure what's going on, and he's feeling really bad about the fact that he's let all of his friends in here, and I really appreciate him. His whole thought process is like, how do I get my friends out of this? Which is definitely par for the course Harry Potter. But I also think that it's very smart. And it just shows Harry's care for other people above himself. Like, he's really frustrated with himself that he got his friends into this mess.
And at the same time, he's sort of confused and not only trying to get them out, but trying to figure out why this is such a big deal, right? He's taken this orb or the sphere that we later learn from Malfoy, Lucius Malfoy, not to be confused with his douchey son, that it's a prophecy about Harry, and that for whatever reason, only Harry or Voldemort can take this prophecy away. And so this is the interesting part in this sort of exchange is as he's both processing through a plan to get out and figuring out what is going on, he kind of gets hit with a difficult piece of information that he has to sort of like check and put in the back burner and be like, I have to figure that out later. And that like the prophecy has to do with him and Voldemort and his scar and the night his parents died, but that Dumbledore knows everything and has not told Harry. And after this whole year he's already had where he feels sort of betrayed by Dumbledore and dejected and all that, he has to take that feeling and he can't comprehend any more than what's already happening. And he has to sort of just put it behind him and be like, I have to worry about that later. And I thought that was so interesting that he's able to, because a lot of people wouldn't be able to get that information and process the fact that they can't process it right now, right? Like he had to go through that very quickly. So along with kind of being himself and wanting to save his friends and the guilt of that, he also now has to add betrayal. So he's confused and guilty and betrayed and doesn't know where Sirius is. And it's like going back to when Ron said a few books ago, like, can one person, or actually, was it this book? It was this book. Can one person really feel all that at the same time?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the fear that Harry feels here, and the amount of information that's being like thrown at him, and he's having to try and process. And what I think is kind of great about Harry in this is that he immediately realizes, like you said, there may be a time to think of that later. Like it can do that later. But the only point is to get out of here. And I just love too, he's kind of like giving orders to his friends about, when to strike, and of course, Bellatrix is making fun of him for it. But, what's great about all of this is that, one, Harry being so scared about the fact that his friends may pay for his stupidity of falling for Voldemort's trick, because, Lucius tells him it's time for you to learn the difference between dreams and reality. And so he's been being fed this whole year has been partly the truth, but partly not the truth, which is a big theme of this book of figuring out who to trust, and who not to trust, and who's telling the truth, and what is the truth. And so I really like that, Harry kind of learns a very valuable lesson here about the people worth trusting. And even as we're asking the question, oh, Dumbledore hadn't told me about this. So that raises a question, obviously, in Harry's mind. Can I trust Dumbledore? So I think it's just really, really strong what's happening here, and I really appreciate, what they're doing. It's really good stuff, I think.
Yeah, it's big, it's deep. We're starting. We've kind of slowly been wading our way into this kind of pool of deeper things. She's been sort of laying the groundwork for all of this for a few books now, honestly, and I think this is sort of where we get plunged really into that reality and some of those super deep storylines and connections and things that she's been drawing up this whole time. And the fact that I like that we kind of, the way she shows you how everything is. So she shows you what happens when a prophecy breaks here without breaking the important one. I do think that some of we do this, sometimes we'll talk a little bit about this, and I think that these next couple chapters are really going to deviate from what is more widely known in this storyline from the movies. This chapter deviates so drastically from that, both in how they get away and how many are really there with them. They're outnumbered 2-1. There are twice as many Death Eaters here as there are kids. And that's different from the movie, which really creates the fact that Voldemort is actually kind of afraid of these kids, like they're a serious threat. He's taking it seriously. And And then the whole sort of sequence that happens from here on, which I think really bleeds into the next chapter. But it's just, there's so much that happens, and the way that they escape is so much more clever in the book than it is in the movie. And they really worked together, and they protected Ginny when they threatened Ginny, and, everyone kept their calm and their cool. And then from there, what happens in this sort of like chase like sequence is just, I like, it's a good blend of severe, like very severe, and you're a little bit afraid for them, but it's also kind of ridiculous at the same time, which I think is an important element she always kind of includes in this magical world, is that these things can happen to you and they become utterly absurd. So it's so fat. This whole chapter becomes really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. One of the most absurd things that happens is that while Harry and Neville are fighting one of the Death Eaters, he falls back into the bell jar. His head does. And his head doesn't crack the glass or anything. He falls through the glass, and his head de-ages to a baby's head. So you have a baby's head on top of the shoulders and the body of a man.
Fully grown adult Death Eater.
Which, I mean, like you said, it's one of those moments where it's just kind of utterly ridiculous and yet creepy and scary and weird. Like, it's everything under the sun there, and it works perfectly, because a lot of the things we see here in the Department of Ministries, it's weird. Like, they break this thing with all of these time turners that keep smashing on the ground and then, like, reforming themselves and smashing on the ground and reforming themselves. So there are a lot of very strange things that happen with this. And you get Ron, who has been hit by some sort of spell that's caused him to go incredibly loopy.
And my favorite part about that is he kind of starts to lose it a little bit. He calls Luna, Loony Luna. But I think I love the most ridiculous part I love about this is like he gets so fascinated with these brains in a tank that he's like, Accio brain, and this brain comes flying out of this tank and like into Ron's hands, and then essentially tries to suffocate Ron. And Ron still thinks, he's like, oh, it's funny. Wait, I don't want it to do this. This is funny. I don't want it to do this. And it's just like the most absurd thing that I so wish had been in the movie, because it would have been so ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, we passed all of these things on their way to the Hall of Prophecy, and now we're having to deal with all of these things as things are exploding because of spells ricocheting all over the place, and we're ending up with just this incredible mess. And then, of course, Ron just kind of going bonkers. Really, I mean, he just kind of goes bonkers because of the spell.
I kind of like to think of this Ron going bonkers, like it's like whatever spell hit him made him instantly the drunkest person you've ever been around, who like just does and says everything you don't want them to do, and you're just like, shut up. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how like I kind of just treated it like Ron was now drunk. Yeah.
No, because that's how he's acting. And so
doesn't seem to understand the severity of what's going on or anything. So we've got, at this point, we've got an unconscious Hermione. We've got a Ginny with a broken ankle. We've got a drunk Ron. We've got a Neville who can't actually speak correctly anymore because he's got a broken nose? He's
got a broken nose. Yep.
So everything comes out as if he's like all stuffy. So all his D's and T's become B's, and like, that actually became a challenge for me to read, because I actually had to kind of read parts of it out loud so I could understand what he was trying to say a few times. But yeah, so we're kind of at a loss during most of this chapter and fighting an uphill Death Eater battle.
Well, and then we also get to the moment where they're surrounded, and we get to the point where Bellatrix starts torturing Longbottom because she realizes who it is, and taunting him about, oh, let's see if you can last as long as your parents did, and like gets really dark. And all hope seems lost until...
However, before we go past that, I do want to say this is that moment for me, I think. We had like a very, very brief moment a few books ago where Neville stands up to Ron and Hermione, and we talked about how that was sort of his Gryffindor coming out, right? Because in a lot of other instances, people are like, why was Neville a Gryffindor? This to me is also that crowning moment where he's being tortured horrendously from what we can, sort of understand of the situation. And he is still telling Harry not to give up the prophecy. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows what it is or what it says or anything about it. He just knows it's important enough that it's worth his life and his pain and his torture. And that, for me, is that moment where you're like, he is a Gryffindor through and through. Like, he is a kind and loving person and, very loyal like you'd expect from the Hufflepuff. But that moment right there where he's enduring the Cruciatus curse, that you're like, all right, he is a Gryffindor, and that's where he belongs.
Absolutely. I was thinking that same thing today. I was rereading the chapter, and I was just really struck by Neville throughout the entire chapter. He is one of the hardest fighters here. He's with Harry the whole way. In fact, he had a chance earlier when Harry said, take Hermione and go, and he said, no, I'm going to follow you. Even though, yes, his nose is broken, he can't even do any spells at this point because he has a broken nose, and so he can't speak correctly. And of course, none of the kids know how to do inaudible spells yet, so which really puts them at a disadvantage in this battle.
And this is the first chapter where we really get introduced to that too, where the Death Eaters are throwing these inaudible spells. Even after I think Hermione takes away the voice. I don't remember what the spell was, but she silences one of the Death Eaters who's trying to call out, and he can still cast spells. And it's kind of like the first moment for all of them that they're like, oh, they can do that. Oh, insert curse word here. Like you can kind of like, it's kind of briefly brushed over, but you can tell to them that they're like, oh, this is a whole new ball game. All right, we got to do the best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it really, again, I think it's the moment they realize there's a whole other level of spellcasting that they just have never experienced before. And I think one of the things too, throughout the books, I think we've had little things where, other magicians like a Dumbledore or something do something like that, but you just kind of think to yourself, oh, that's Dumbledore. I think this is the moment where we all fully realize that, no, this is something that as you get older and you move on in being a wizard, it is something that you could learn. And so I think, it's pretty crazy. And with all of them surrounded, Neville is getting tortured. All hope does seem lost. And then, to our amazement, and this is very different from the movie because they're not doing that kind of like weird apparating all around the place, flying thing, which I honestly kind of like because I felt like it made wizards too much like superheroes in the movie. It just didn't seem legitimate to me in her world, but we actually get bursting through the doors. We get Sirius, Lupin, Moody, Tonks, and Kingsley, who come in to save the day. But
I don't even think that's the same mix that's in the movie. I want to say Kingsley isn't there in the movie.
I don't remember him being in the movie.
I don't remember him being in this scene in the movie.
No.
I remember it being Sirius, Tonks, Lupin. Well, and part of it too is because the difference in the characters, right? In the movie, they really only have like 6 Death Eaters, and 6 kids. So if you sent 4 Order of the Phoenix, it would be okay. And here it's 6 and 6 and 12. So now it's like 12 against 12, and it's sort of a fair fight now.
Yes, which is
just for your daily math lesson.
Yes,
6 and 6 equals 12. Boom.
And there's some great moments here. Neville, who can't even talk, helps save Harry by jabbing Hermione's wand into a Death Eater's mask and allowing Harry the time to stun him. Then you get Harry being able to save Sirius, and then you get the fact that while Harry is trying to save Neville and get away, the prophecy breaks.
And it's so much going on. It's so loud in there that they can't understand it or hear it, or they have no idea what it says. They just see the white figure come out and then dissipate.
Yeah. So we don't even really get a sense as to what the prophecy is yet pertaining to Harry, which is a big difference, I think, from the movie, which has already given us a taste at this point of what that is. But Harry doesn't even have time to think about that, because this is the point where Neville's like, Dumbledore's here. And Dumbledore just strides in as if like he's on a holiday, just taking on people left and right. And like, they're absolutely no issue for him. And this is a moment where we just kind of start to see exactly how powerful Dumbledore is, because whereas everybody else has been having these battles with the Death Eaters, there's no battle for him. He just stops them for the most part.
And by Dumbledore, you mean Dumbledore.
Yes.
Because Neville can't pronounce it.
Which is kind of great. And as Dumbledore is wrapping up all of these other Death Eaters, the one battle that is still going on is Sirius and Bellatrix. And as Sirius kind of taunts Bellatrix, she is able to get one spell past, and he disappears into the veil. And it's kind of this incredible moment, and I think the movie actually does this pretty well, as Sirius's body kind of has the look of surprise and kind of grace all at the same time as he falls into the veil and disappears.
It's so there's a few things that differ here, in that, you know, in the movie they make a point of Sirius calling Harry James. In the book he says nice one, and in the movie he says nice one, James, which kind of distracts Harry and then gives Harry this feeling of guilt, because in the movie Harry is the one whose guard is let down, and then the killing strike comes from Bellatrix because Harry's guard, or at least Harry feels like it's because his guard is down, right? That's kind of the insinuation they give you in the movie. Where in the book, it's Sirius's own sort of arrogance that does it himself in, which has been being built up throughout all of the books and all of the time we've known Sirius, is that everyone has basically been alluded to the fact that his arrogance is going to be his downfall in some way, shape, or form. And that's exactly what happened.
And it's a really sad moment, because, you know, Harry, he is having a very hard time. Like he's just waiting for Sirius to kind of come back through the curtain, and, you know, Lupin grabs him and tells him, you know, it's too late. There's nothing you can do. He's gone. And that's the way that this chapter ends. So unfortunately, we have to wait till next week to see this play out. And I would say, you know, this chapter is the one where I think there are lots of really small, interesting things that are happening. But it's the next chapter that takes what this chapter did, and it kind of rocks the world here, because there are some things that happen in there that are going to reverberate throughout the rest of the series for Harry Potter that happen in this next chapter. And
this chapter sort of summed up some of the more like straightforward action plots that have been going on recently. And the next chapter is really going to speak to some of the larger themes and then continue sort of the mystery of everything that's going on. So it's kind of, there's so much in this chapter and so much in the next chapter, but it's so different because this one is much more straightforward, and you don't have as much depth to what's happening, because all of that processing and depth is going to come in the chapter immediately following.
Yeah. And
then the one after that, and then I think we're on a new book.
Well, and I think one of the things that I do like about this chapter, and again, I think beyond the thing that this does better than the movie in a sense, is that because you get more of a battle between the kids and the Death Eaters, you get a greater sense of how much these children have progressed throughout the year, that they are a worthy foe in the end for these Death Eaters, but there's also that sense of then seeing just how far they still have to go. They're almost good enough, but they're just not good enough yet. And I think I really appreciate that about, I think, the way that she writes the story. Obviously, she has more time and everything, and I just think it plays out better than it does in the movie because they kind of have to get and want to get to the larger sense of action that we're going to get in the next chapter.
Yeah, I also think that this chapter and the way that it's written versus the movie, you really believe the amount of peril that the kids are in. I feel like the movie rushes through that part really quickly. And the movie also keeps them all together. Like they stay together as a unit, they're moving on, right? And in the book, they end up being kind of splintered, they end up injured, they end up like there's just kind of a wider variety of peril that they're put in the book. And in fact, something we brushed over, but Harry is kind of for the first time actually confronted with the fact that, Hermione gets hit with a spell by we mentioned by the one Death Eater who she silences, right? And that's when they kind of realize that you can cast these spells without words. And it hits her and nobody knows what the spell is. Nobody knows if she's okay. And Harry, there's even a section where it says like Harry's afraid to look too closely at her because he cannot deal with what it might tell him right now. Like he doesn't want to know if she's dead right now because he can't handle the fact that she might be dead, right? And so that's another moment where Neville really steps up and he's like, I'll do it. He checks her pulse, knows exactly what Harry's doing, and tells him, she's fine. There's a pulse. We got to keep moving, right? And it's just so interesting how vital Neville becomes. But, they've separated off, so he doesn't know if Luna and Ginny and Ron are okay. And it's just such a more dramatic and sort of significant, I think, fight in the book than it is in the movie. The movie, they run through a hall and into the room with the arch, and then they get stopped by all the Death Eaters and they're sort of kidnapped. And it's just like, it's not nearly as
chaotic.
And it's not as terrifying. Like you're reading this and you're like, we don't know where they are. We don't know what's going on. And there's this moment where you're actually a little bit worried what's going to happen to them all.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you put it perfectly there. I think there's a lot more terror in this, and we mentioned the fact that there's some humor in this too. But there's a lot more terror in this, and I think there's a lot more fear for our characters because we do split up for a while, and we don't get to see what happens to some of them for a while, and then when we return, like Ginny has a broken ankle, like things like that, where it's just like. You realize there's a whole other part of the story that we don't get to see because we follow Harry's part of the story and Harry's perspective in these books. And so, yeah, I think it's really a good job because I think it just makes it too more realistic as well. Like in the sense that like they do get split up and then they don't know what happened to each other and then they come back and then, like you said, with the fear of Hermione getting hit by this spell and all, I mean, it's just so much better. It just really is.
And I think it's something, as you're talking and I'm thinking about it and sort of processing it, I'm a process out loud person. I feel bad for whoever ends up sitting with me at work because I'll be like, I need to say this out loud for 10 minutes, even though I'm going to draw my own conclusion. I really think that's one of the big differences between the book and the movie. I think... And this kind of applies to a lot of movies, and it's my husband's huge gripe with really popular box office films right now. So many of them become sequels and trilogies and 4, 5, 6 movies, right? Especially when you talk about the Marvel universe, how interconnected they all are. You can't really truly fear for your main character's life because there's another movie coming out. Because they're in the next Avengers movie. Because we know these things, right? We know that Hermione or Emma Watson is billed for the next 2 movies, so she doesn't die, right? We know these things. And so reading the book, there's this genuine moment, if you don't know the rest of the story, where you fear that one of these main characters might actually die. There are 6 main characters, and there's nothing holding her back from killing off one of them. And that, I think, for me is that moment when I'm reading it that, like, I believe that. And that makes it scarier for me. And I think that's one thing that doesn't always come through on film, because too much of, like, maybe the real world or reality bleeds in. And you're like, oh, no, we can't kill off that person because I saw them on the movie poster for the next one or whatever. And so I think this is that moment in the book, especially on a first read through, where you're like, oh my God, these characters could die. Like, all of them could actually die, except for maybe Harry, because we know there's other books. But I mean, the rest of them could absolutely die. There's nothing stopping her from doing that. Maybe except for, little moral compass of killing off all the kids. But yeah.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point here, because you're absolutely right that, by the time we get to the movies, obviously, we know what's coming, because
we know what's happening.
But you really do have a sense in this book, like, there is a real feeling of danger. Like, other Harry Potter books are coming, but you're not guaranteed that these characters are going to live. You think that they will, probably, but you still don't really know that. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that, this fight, I think, is scarier in the book, because you do have that separation of time. You do have the fact that you're worried about what's going to happen to those characters. And then you, like I said earlier, you come back to this, the characters coming back together, and you're like, oh man, Ginny's got a broken ankle. Hermione's still out of commission at this point. She's, Neville's had his nose broken. He's getting tortured, there's just and then to top it all off, like, at the end of this chapter, like, we haven't really even talked about it in this sense, but Sirius dies. So, like, it accentuates exactly what you're saying, this idea that, yes, you have a character here who is dead. And, like, it's one more member of Harry's family that's died. And it's just, it's kind of...
It's almost cruel.
It is cruel. Yeah, it feels cruel.
Yeah.
And I think...
It's kicking him when he's already down.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just... It's impactful, and it's meant to be impactful, but we don't really get to see that impact. We don't even really get to see it in the next chapter.
No,
it's several chapters out before we really get to understand the impact of what just happened.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. We will not get to have any kind of true experience of the death of Sirius until 2 chapters after this. And so, I mean, we really are not going to be able to deal with the ramifications for Harry for this fully until that chapter. And I would say it will still be something that lingers throughout the rest of the series, and especially into that second, especially into the, and it's not a spoiler, I don't think, to say that into the Half-Blood Prince, that Harry is still going to be kind of wrestling with some of the ramifications of this death. And so yeah, I think all in all, this chapter, it is the thing that it's like these last, I think, or at least these 3 chapters together, the one we had last week, the one we have now, and the one we have next week, truly like, and I guess the week after that too, they all create like this. You remember, I don't remember if you remember, but in Deep Space Nine, they had like a 9-part arc at the end of the series where it's like, once you watch one episode, you just kind of keep, and that's what these chapters are like.
Binge the rest of them.
You binge the rest of these chapters. So unfortunately, we don't binge these chapters, so we only go one chapter at a time, and you will have to wait to see what happens.
Well, we don't binge them on the podcast. That doesn't mean we don't binge them.
That's true. Drea, if anybody does want to catch up with you and talk with some ramifications for this chapter or what's coming up next, where can they find you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at PCFChick or on Instagram like Hannah Banana Dog did at Drea Coffman, and it's Coffman.
And you could find me here on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, or Vero under the name MattRushing02. You can also find me here on the network doing Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. You can find me over on the Trek FM network doing 2 shows. One's called The Orb. I talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine with my good friend Chris Jones. You can find me doing the General Geek Show over there, which is called the 602 Club, and that's where we talk about all of the fandoms we love. We've talked all about the Harry Potter series. We've talked about the Fantastic Beasts series over there, as well as so much else, so please check that out. And then last but not least, talking about films through the lens of faith with my good friend Courtney on a show called Cinema Stories. But we want to say thank you so much for checking your Outpost.
Mischief managed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.